Next up, we are going to have Karen Boyle. She is going to give a short keynote, and then she will have a conversation with my co-moderator, Johanna Kolinen. So Karen Boyle, the author of MeToo, Weinstein, and Feminism, a book that has gone to the top of my list of to read. It provides a feminist analysis of MeToo and the sexual assault allegations against celebrity perpetrators, which have emerged since the Weinstein story of October 2017. Her argument explores the media depiction of feminism and feminists in the wake of Weinstein and the cultural values associated with men's abuse, particularly within the film and television industries. Karen, are you here?
I am indeed.
Okay, great. Take it away. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for that introduction, Melissa, and thank you, Dorta, for getting this session off to such a great start. I want to start my remarks today by briefly reflecting on the title of this session, If You Don't Interrupt It, You Allow It. Because I think this poses a really useful provocation about whose responsibility it is to end sexual harassment and abuse. My own research has most recently focused on both social media and legacy media responses to the Weinstein case and the wider discourse around the MeToo hashtag. And this does give me slight pause in thinking about whose responsibility it is to interrupt, to speak out, and ultimately end sexual harassment and abuse. And whilst I'll argue that we do all have a role to play, I want to preface this by asserting that the ultimate responsibility for abuse always lies with the perpetrator. Now, since the New York Times story of October 2017, I'm sure we've all heard and read time and time again that everybody knew about Weinstein, that his behaviour was an open secret, that he was hiding in plain sight. And I think one of the unfortunate implications of the way this story has been more widely taken up is that it far too easily slips into victim blaming. Given what everybody knew, why did she agree to go to his hotel room? I can't tell you how many times I've read or heard that question. And it shifts responsibility, presenting his behaviour as inevitable and making it the responsibility of others to stop it. And you see that too in meme culture, which is focused on what prominent female friends of Weinstein's knew or didn't know, something that's raised its head again this week, with Weinstein trending on Twitter in the aftermath of Michelle Obama's convention speech. Her opponents foregrounding her historical remarks about Weinstein being a wonderful human being and a good friend as a way of undermining her current credibility. And what concerns me about both these examples is that it makes men's abuse a story about women's culpability. There's a link between victim blaming and broader women blaming that we need to be cautious of, while at the same time being willing to be critical of complicity, including our own. As Victoria Thomas talked about this morning, how do we hold ourselves accountable? Yet despite the fact that everybody apparently knew, when the Weinstein story broke, it was widely portrayed as shocking, surprising, and dependent on people breaking the silence. Indeed, Time magazine, as I'm sure you know, named the MeToo silence breakers their Person of the Year in December 2017. And a group of Weinstein survivors also used this term to present themselves outside the New York courthouse during Weinstein's trial, which gives me pause to remember it was actually at the beginning of this year. It's been such an odd year. So how do we reconcile these two apparently opposing viewpoints? That everybody knew about this behaviour, and yet there was a silence around it which had to be broken. And I should say that this is by no means unique to the way the story of the Weinstein case has been told. And prior work I'd done, for instance, on coverage of the Jimmy Savile case in the UK found very, very similar patterns. What changed wasn't necessarily that women broke the silence. As Dorta's already reminded us, many of these women told their stories decades before, and indeed in some cases had made complaints or gone to the police. The silence wasn't necessarily personal, but it was political. It was not always an absence of speech, but an absence of recognition. So what changed? Well, at least three things. One, that individual stories were collectively linked, not least by the affordances of social media. Secondly, that the stories were recognised as stories of abuse. And thirdly, that the men at the heart of these stories were often no longer in positions of the same power as they had been. Now, I'm not really going to talk about this last point. I want to focus on the first two. And I'll start by saying something about collectivity. Because a central problem I've found with much of the MeToo discourse as it's been taken up in mainstream media is its lack of historicisation. Women have been speaking out for decades. They have been doing so collectively for decades. And feminist organisations have been working to support and advocate for victims and survivors and to challenge perpetrators and the institutions which have supported them for decades. Now, this was acknowledged to an extent in mainstream discourse around Me Too when it was linked to the wider Me Too movement founded by Tarana Burke. That movement was itself a response to and development of a longer-standing feminist movement against men's violence, which had unevenly considered the experiences of the Black and brown women that Burke worked with. Burke's own reflections on the way in which her contribution has been acknowledged in mainstream media discourse are significant here, however. She suggests that she's been acknowledged as a founder, but not as a leader. And her experience as a founder is linked to her experience as a survivor. Now, I don't want to minimise this, of course. Survivors are also activists. But it's the fact that it's the personal and not political, which is the focus of mainstream media interest, that I think is problematic. And this is emblematic of a wider problem in news discourse, where the ongoing work of activist and specifically feminist organisations is largely invisible. And it's certainly not visible as a source of expertise. In my research focusing on coverage of the Weinstein case, for instance, I found very, very few mentions of organisations like RAIN or Rape Crisis, though they clearly could have put what was happening into a broader context and provided signposting to support for survivors in the audience. Again, this pattern is not unique to the Weinstein case. We're seeing it at the moment in coverage of the Epstein case too. Time's Up has in lots of ways provided opportunities to link the Me Too discussion into that wider history. But in terms of mainstream media responses, there's still a tendency to present feminism as an opinion rather than a knowledge base and source of expertise. And I was really thinking of this listening to Tabitha Jackson's opening comments yesterday, when she talked as though it's only our knowledge that seems to be situated, not all knowledge, and we need to acknowledge that. And it's a problem. And partly it's a problem because it continually puts the onus back on survivors to personally speak out. Now, I would never want to detract from the power and importance of survivor speech. We owe the survivors of Me Too a huge debt. But speaking out should never be an imperative. Survivors do not owe us their speech, and we have decades worth of speech we can draw on already to envisage a way forward. I did a piece of work looking at how feminism was presented in coverage of the Weinstein case in the English language press. And when I looked at the Time's Up launch, I was really disappointed to find that, for instance, while the activists who attended the Golden Globes and the organisations they worked with were widely named, they were not directly quoted, and nor was the nature of their work considered. This is not a criticism of those women, rather it's to highlight the missed opportunities to make this part of a wider conversation. But of course, if the news and entertainment media won't do it, we can, and we do. We can and do educate ourselves about these ongoing histories, share information, raise profiles, and signal boost their work. We can all help change the landscape so we don't lose sight of those histories and that knowledge again. And so survivors don't have to keep speaking publicly again and again for us to understand the necessity of change. Now, I want to move on to the second point, that women's stories were there, but weren't recognised as stories of abuse. As I've said, the problem wasn't necessarily that women had been silent. The problem was that what happened to them was not, or what was done to them, I should say, was not recognised as problematic. And one factor here was their status relative to that of their abusers. They simply didn't matter enough for this to become a substantive issue. Their abusers had more power and, crucially, more credibility. Now, in my book, I go into a longer argument about this in relation to the sexualised history of women in the film industry. The women who tried to speak out about Weinstein, both before and after October 2017, found that their credibility was often at stake because of the sexualised nature of the industry in which they worked or aspired to work. Yes, Weinstein had professional power, but at least as importantly, he had a credibility the women didn't by virtue of his gender and the long history of the sexist sexualisation within the industry in which he worked. To be clear, to argue that film acting is a sexualised position for women is not a value judgment. It's to illustrate the double bind in which women working in film are caught. Their success often depends on their sexualisation, yet that undermines the seriousness with which they're judged, not only as artists, but also as victims and survivors of sexual exploitation and abuse. And I'm really interested to hear later whether intimacy coordinators can be part of just breaking that open. Now, the abuse wasn't seen as abuse, but as something else. Think of the way the casting couch has long been part of Hollywood's mythology and indeed its glamour to the outside world. Linked to this, we have the auteur apologist narrative, that these kind of abuses are to be expected given the artistic sensitivities and temperaments of men in the business. Or in Weinstein's case, given that we'd struggle to think of him as an auteur, it's to be expected in successful business. This is the kind of ruthlessness required, not taking no for an answer, being persistent, dogmatic. And I find that every time I sort of think of this, I also recall something like Trump's The Art of the Deal. So it wasn't rape, it was an addition. It was an opportunity. It was a calculated risk. It was just Harvey being Harvey. For the abuse to have continued without significant consequence until October 2017, required the cultural normalisation of men's sexual violation of women. And that cultural normalisation functioned as an alibi for abusive men like Weinstein, not least by rendering so many others complicit. This is what a rape culture looks like. However, in my writing about the Weinstein case, I've shied away from the term rape culture because I think it's actually about something more than that. It's about the historical, cultural value of abuse for the film industry. The everybody knew narrative suggests that sexual and sexualised abuse has not just been tolerated in the industry, but has been consistent with the stories the film industry has often wanted to tell about itself. And those stories have sold. They've sold newspapers, magazines, biographies, as well as the films themselves. They've also been normalised in certain strands of film studies. One of the notable things about the Hollywood MeToo stories is how many relied on material which had been in the public domain for some time, often in biographies, interviews, or celebratory accounts of the making of particular films. They were there, they were acknowledged and embraced as part of the culture of making great films and producing great performances. In my wider work, I've come across countless examples of this, and perhaps the most insidious is when men's abuse of women is presented as the enabler of women's success. It brings out the strong performances. It helps women win awards. And I think this echoes what we heard from Dorta earlier. Women's success is something that is done to them. In Brave, Rose McGowan says of method acting, and I quote, "I have never met a female method actor. To me, I'm a method actor is usually synonymous with I'm going to be a fucking dick to everybody on set. I've never been on a set where that bad behaviour wasn't indulged." End quote. Indulged, not tolerated. It's woven into the fabric of how the film industry has for too long thought about itself and how it has been valued and admired. And that's the wider reckoning which MeToo has initiated. But we've still got a long way to go. What can we do? Well, over the course of the weekend, you'll hear a lot of important and practical work which is already being done. What I want to add to that is a call for us all to think about how we can devalue abuse. This is not just about working practices. It's also fundamentally about representational practices. Whose stories we believe, whose stories we foreground, the euphemisms we use to disguise the realities of violence and abuse, what we take to be the measures of success and how we talk about those, who we believe to be the experts, whose histories we know, share and respect. In short, you can't end sexual harassment unless you end gender inequality, representationally as well as materially. Individual survivors, creatives, and feminist organisations have been doing that work for decades. There's still more to do and more to learn. And the conversations this morning really reflected on that, I think. We will get things wrong and there are things we don't know yet, but we are not starting from scratch. We know things and we know people who know things. And that means we can change things. And I'll end my remarks there.
I think I'm going to come back. Can you hear me, Karen?
I can, Melissa, yeah.
Okay, great. I'm going to come back in. I'm going to thank you. And Johanna's going to talk with you in a brief moment. But I want to just highlight one quick thing. Firstly, my mind is blown. Because you were able to articulate everything in ways that I think I have been trying to deal with for over a decade. But I just wanted to highlight one point that I think I'm going to think about for a really long time. Is you said the cultural value of abuse of the film industry is consistent with the stories the film industry has wanted to tell. So it's all intertwined.
Yeah.
So I'm going to thank you again and leave you for a conversation with Johanna. Thank you for your work. I am very much looking forward to reading the book.
Thank you, Melissa.
Yeah, thank you so much, Karen. Hi from me as well. That has been so interesting to listen to, and yeah, I have so many questions. But I'm going to start with a reflection. I think it's very interesting. You really put your finger on something there with this idea of who matters more. This the worth that this certain type of man is creating in an artistic or an economic system. And we do have this idea. In Sweden, we've talked about the culture man, but in different countries, this has come out in different ways. The male genius. The auteur, of course, in our industry as an object, but also the mogul, who is a kind of auteur of business, right? As an object of cultural and financial worth. And we know, of course, that this goes back to a 19th century idea, like this whole idea of the artist as separate from the craftsman. Has a deep history in sort of Eurocentric or quote unquote Western art, and I think that has shaped how we think about these artist men in the film industry as well. And what's so curious to me about that is that idea of being an artist, what the quality is that you need to have talent, it's kind of magical quality that can come like sort of from the earth or from God or from the folk or from the ground, and you have to have intuition to be able to shape it, and then combined with discipline and grit and ruthlessness and daring intellect and these kinds of things. But this irrationality, which is not in our culture typically coded as a male virtue, is permitted fully with these artists men. I mean, because these artist men, they are so emotional, they can't they can't control their impulses. That's what we're saying when we're saying that it's to be expected. And I wonder if you wanted to reflect on this idea. What is an artist? And then how do we think about what is a female artist, or what is an artist who is not like this?
I think that's a really good point. I also don't think I think it plays out in a specific way when we're talking about film. And I think there's a language that's used to talk about artists in the film industry that particularly opens up this. I also don't think it's specific to the film industry. I think the specific language that's used might be different, but the ideas underpinning it are typically the same, which are that male behaviour is legitimated because men are the ones in power who are deciding the terms on which these decisions are made. So if I can just give you an example from my field, I'm an academic. And I remember attending, just as I was starting, just before this story broke actually, I was attending a seminar on funding in academia, because that's where it's at. We've got to know where to get our funding. And some male colleagues gave this presentation where the final slide that they showed was of Kevin Spacey in House of Cards. This was before the story of Anthony Rapp spoke out and others. And the caption was don't take no for an answer, never take no for an answer. And I wasn't very impressed by this, partly because the stories in House of Cards, of course, legitimate a particular, so to use that as a model, however ironically they intended it, I think was really problematic. But that phrase, don't take no for an answer, it's used endlessly in academia, it's used in business, it's used, and it normalizes not taking feedback, not listening to others. It normalizes individualism. And it's something I think we really need to try and be conscious of and resist. I'm sure it's a phrase I've used endlessly, and it was just them putting it in that context which made me kind of see red. And that's part of what I think this whole thing's about. It involves all of us reflecting on what we've accepted and what we've taken for granted. And that process isn't easy. Let's not kid ourselves.
When you said that it normalizes not listening, I noticed in my body, I felt provoked. I thought, well, of course, I can't, if I'm a creator, if I am a creative, I have to create also, I have to have a space that is mine. Like, it's hard enough to get a room of one's own, and now I also have to listen to everybody. But I also know, of course, this is an internalized thing. Of course, I know that is not what you're saying at all. I understand that what we're saying is that, and I mean, literally this morning, I myself gave a talk at this conference where I talked about the enormous artistic power and financial power in listening to our audience. So and our collaborators of diverse voices. So, but even in myself, that is how deeply this is internalized.
But I think we can use different ways. We can challenge ourselves to think about different ways of saying these things. That's kind of what a lot of this is about. And sometimes it can seem like a real luxury. Look, why does it matter how we talk about these things? It really doesn't matter. What matters much more is that there are services for survivors in place, that women have access to funding to tell their own stories. And of course, all of those things are fundamentally important. And, material change is essential. But I'm bound to say this as someone who does media studies, but, changes in representation don't only follow changes in reality, they can also lead the way. So if we can change the way we think about things, the stories that we promote and the language we use to talk about them, then I think that is part of this bigger picture. It's an activist act.
I think in the Nordic countries where we are very state oriented, I think there has been a rhetorical shift or attempt, at least, to frame this when we're looking at solutions and paths forwards to shame sexual harassment also and at film shoots, for instance, as a workplace safety issue. And we have pretty good work safety legislation and saying, no, obviously workplace harassment is unacceptable, and we already have ways of dealing with this. And there is a kind of, again, this kind of gut reaction resistance to that, because it's where people think, yeah, but like even female filmmakers are saying, yeah, but I mean, it's not a normal workplace. It's not your random workplace. And what we mean by that is that there is a romance also to the process of creativity, where if you try to put it in a box of procedure and law, somehow that would make the art less powerful. And I think in this particular context, it's just like, I don't think, if you have good catering, that is also maybe not artistically required, but I'm pretty sure that it makes people work better on set. So it doesn't have to be any more or less romantic than just like having catering for people's special diets on set or something like that. But there is, of course, this idea still that we are also romanticizing our industry from the inside. And that's one of the reasons many of us got into this to begin with, to be somewhere special that is not, an off.
But many industries or sectors romanticise themselves in that way. And in Scotland, earlier this year, we just went through a very high-profile sexual assault trial where our former First Minister, Alex Salmond, was on trial on 14, then 13 accounts of sexual assault, including attempted rape. Now, he was found not guilty or not proven, which is a Scottish specific verdict. But actually, a lot of the discussion around that case mirrored exactly what you've just said. But you've got to understand that in politics, this is the way it is. In politics, you know, we have to allow for these kinds of working conditions. We have to allow for this kind of speech. We have to understand the normal rules don't apply. So if they don't apply in politics and they don't apply in film, where do they apply? You know, which sectors do these normal rules apply to? Why are we always creating these special cases? I think is something we need to be alert to or drill down into a bit.
I think that's absolutely true. And I think also it's worth, I mean, I could immediately think of all kinds of sectors where work is very different from, like, I don't know, childcare. You know, there are many work environments where our social interactions are very physical or very different from around like an arbitrary factory or office situation. Or where we have very intense work or very long hours, and we are able to figure out rules for doing that appropriately just fine. So of course there's no reason, you know, but I think these are the kind of rhetorical traps that we end up in ourselves. You did say something very important about power distribution here, and I guess that, I mean, of course you're absolutely right, and it's interesting, I hadn't thought about it at all, that all this historical the historical movement to advocate for victims has been largely invisible in this debate. At the same time, the fact that we're even having that MeToo was possible surely is a consequence of all of that activism. And then when people say, but well, you know, this is very important, but public shaming is not the answer. Yeah, but we got to the point of public shaming because private shaming didn't help. Either we didn't do the private shaming, because, you know, we have to hold ourselves accountable, or it was those of us who tried to move within the existing systems didn't get any kind of result from it. And we have come to a point where sexual harassment is unacceptable, even though it is still possible. And now I think something has shifted. I don't know if you agree.
I do. The optimistic me does. The pessimistic me sometimes doesn't and thinks we've got a long way to go. But I think that question really about where the voices of activists been in this is really important. And I just want to offer one quick anecdote about this. I work with a number of organisations in Scotland that are frontline services supporting victims and survivors. And when I've talked to them about the media response to MeToo, one of the things they've reflected on is the media went to them for a response when it became a story about has MeToo gone too far. So they didn't go to them as experts who could give evidence about what survivors had experienced. They didn't go to them at that stage in the story. They went to them when it was a story where they could pit women against women, saying, has MeToo gone too far? And that is part of the problem. We're not hearing those voices. We're not seeing that longevity. And that puts the onus endlessly on individuals to speak out. And as I say, I would never detract from the value and importance of that speech, but it should never be mandated. It should never be an imperative. And enough people have spoken out that we need to be able to listen to that and move forward.
Yeah, I guess that this does make me think, you know, we have always said, or at least since second generation feminism, we've said the personal is political. But there's something problematic with that language, right? We talked this morning about that we say nobody is free until everyone is free, but we don't quite mean everyone. And with the personal is political, I guess in a way it's like, yeah, but it's not like, yeah, but how political, or like it's not hard politics, or there's that tension there that it's always in the end just these personal stories, because we have to talk about structures, right? And that's where it gets uncomfortable. How do we? I mean, because if you're looking at this, I guess who the perpetrators are, it's very easy to make it a question only of gender. But when we're looking at you know, in rare cases the perpetrators are women, and then it's also a function of power, you know, and how power is expressed in our culture. So then that means we have to redistribute power, and for media that is a very uncomfortable narrative suddenly. Then they have to be all aboard with the feminist agenda.
That sounds good.
Yeah, no, I'm all for it, you know. But can we achieve that?
I want to reflect briefly on that personal is political. There's a really interesting book about What Happened When Women Said Incest. It's called Rocking the Cradle of Sexual Politics. It came out in the 90s by Louise Armstrong. And she's talking in that book about what it was like to be a survivor. She refers to herself as the first living, breathing incest survivor, because the media suddenly took up her story. There was lots of interest. And she makes what to me is one of those quotes that just stays in my mind, that she says that once the story got taken up by the media, that slogan of the personal is the political was deformed to become the personal is the personal. So they wanted endless personal stories, but the next step was not there. And when feminists started organising speak outs or consciousness raising sessions in the 70s, and of course that goes further back in other movements as well, they weren't asking people to speak out for the sake of speaking out. They were using those personal stories to build a political analysis. And that's the step we lose too often in a media narrative that's really caught up with that idea of the personal. And you know, Tarana Burke, I think, has reflected on that really powerfully, that the media want her personal story. They want her to be a founder, but it's like all the work she's done in the, what is it, I think 14 years since MeToo was founded has, you know, that's not what they're interested in. They're not interested in that graph. They're not interested in that work. They're interested in that personal story of survival, of, you know, starting something, but not seeing it through. So yeah, I'd like more stories of seeing it through.
We have a little bit extra time, so if you have a few more minutes, I'd like to ask you about that. I'm wondering about this because, you know, this, you're putting it very delicately, but we're entering on an issue of white feminism here. And I guess in the responses to Me Too, I feel like I've seen, at least here in the Nordic countries that I followed more closely, also tensions between different generations of feminisms. And I think even in the introduction of the book, you say, well, perhaps there's a fourth generation of feminism, perhaps there isn't. Maybe you could touch a little bit on that and see how effectively or not the different feminisms have been working together here, generational and otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important question. I would certainly not want to gloss over the extent to which there's tension and disagreement. I mean, you know, feminism, Bell Hooks puts this brilliantly when she says that feminism is a movement to end sexism, sexist exploitation and oppression. And I think that idea of movement too often gets lost because movements have to move, they have to change, they have to adapt, they have to learn. And, you know, that process won't always be easy. And I'm certainly not romanticizing, say, the 70s and the work of the 70s in terms of when many of these say rape crisis centres in my context in Scotland were set up. But I also don't want to lose their contributions, because if we lose their contributions, we start from scratch. And we also need to be really careful that we don't just think it's the 70s and now, because, you know, in Scotland, for instance, Rape Crisis was founded in the 1970s, so was Scottish Women's Aid. They have not stopped ever since. They've been, you know, we have got 4 decades more of people who have been doing this work on the front line, and I want to learn with them. I don't want to dismiss their knowledge. I want to learn with them. How we make that truly intersectional is a really, really important point. But I just wanted to pick up on this idea of Me Too as white feminism, just really briefly, because one of the things that frustrated me when I was writing the book about Me Too was that critique was usually a critique of the mainstream media story about Me Too. So the mainstream media story about Me Too was a story about white feminism. It was a story about celebrities. It was a story about, you know, actors. But actually the work that was going on in social media under the hashtag #MeToo was not that. There were people globally using this hashtag to tell their stories. So I think we've got to be a bit careful about claiming that the movement was about white feminism when that's what the story the mainstream media chose to tell about the movement. And then we can all think about, okay, so how can we make that movement different? How can we amplify different voices within it? Which I think is an important question. And one of the things that social media enables, you know, if we don't like the story, we can to an extent change it.
Yeah.
Not fully, but we can to an extent.
And I guess one thing that does strike me here is also that the generations of feminism are not inevitable, but there tends to be a progression. And you know, there's that very familiar William Gibson quote where he says that the future is already here, is just unevenly distributed. And I often think of it in reverse, that the past is also here, is just unevenly distributed. And when we're thinking about activism on a global scale, you know, we don't have to go further than to EU countries even to see that the most basic rights of women and sexual minorities, gender minorities are threatened. Abortion rights are threatened everywhere, and so on. And there are so many countries in the world that have no rape crisis centers at all. You know, and certainly there are still places where women, you know, don't have democratic representation, and of course, so then you have to start at sort of zero, and that means that none of the work historically, you know, is wasted. At the same time, we have to question the efficiency, as you're saying. If we in countries where we have had rape crisis centers since the 70s, and the only real effect, apart from some support to individual victims, is that reporting prevalence has gone up, but we don't think that the structures have changed at all, then it's not working. Then we need to do something else as well, you know.
I would be slightly more, I agree and disagree on that point.
Okay.
I think in some ways I would be slightly more optimistic. When I look back at the work that was done in the 70s, and I read women's accounts of trying to seek refuge in the 1970s, for instance, things have changed to an extent. They have not changed fully, but the services are there, and we should never, ever, I think, minimize how important those frontline services are. They save lives. They literally save lives. And they weren't there 40, 50 years ago in my country, and they aren't there in some places now. So let's not forget that. I mean, we are talking about saving lives here.
Oh, for sure. And yeah, and they cannot be defunded, even though that is a constant.
But that's a really important point, that, you know, there is sometimes, I think, a complacency about it now, right? We've done that. We did that a while ago. We're sorted now. We don't have this problem. And certainly in my context, there's a lot of defunding of these organisations, or just the sense that they don't have continuous funding and they continually have to fundraise for everything. And a really, really striking disjuncture there that hit me was, I mentioned Alex Salmond earlier, our former First Minister. When the charges were first laid against him, he launched a crowdfunder for his own defence. And within, I can't remember, the figures might be slightly wrong here, but it was within something like 24 hours, he raised £60,000 or something like that.
Yeah.
At the same time, later, Rape Crisis were trying to raise £16,000 during the 16 days of action to fund vital services. And that took them like weeks and weeks and months, and they managed to raise £16,000. And then you've got this man in a position of huge power who can raise that money like that. So,
and I think that again, like Paul said, I mean, we're going to have to end here, but I think that again reminds us that the thing that MeToo made visible is that this problem is everywhere, and what we've talked about is again that how unevenly it hits the victims. And yeah, we're going to have to change it. Thank you so much for taking the time, Karen. This was super interesting, and I'll let Melissa come back on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.